do a tour of Colonial Park Cemetery, and we're partnering with Massie Heritage Center. Thank you. And our guide for today is Charlotte Landon. Charlotte Landon was the superintendent and general manager of the White Plains Rural Cemetery in White Plains, New York for 16 years. Organized in 1854, White Plains Rural was designed following the ideals and practices of the rural cemetery movement, which began in 1831. The 27-acre non-denominational cemetery is included on the New York State and National Registries of Historic Places. Ms. Landon is a retired high school English teacher, and since moving to Savannah in 2009, has taught at Memorial Day School and Beach High School. She's also a tour guide, having worked for the Owens Thomas House, Savannah Taste Experience Food Tours, and currently as a program guide at the Massie Heritage Center. And we're really happy that you joined us today.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to go ahead and get inside and start. I have way more information than will fill an hour, so hopefully somebody will say, "You're done, finished." To keep me kind of on track. My interest lies not so much in the really famous people who are buried here. You can easily come in and read those markers. And so I didn't necessarily want to focus on that. My interest is on the untold stories. And we are a city that is so intertwined with myth and legend that it is really sometimes virtually impossible to separate the reality from the legend. And we all love the legends, of course, but I'm interested mostly in what's the real story. I will burst some of the bubbles, I'm sorry to say, and some of the stories that are near and dear to our hearts. Sadly, there is not a documentation to support those stories, but hopefully I'll be able to give you some even better stuff that you can add into your knowledge base. So we'll begin, we'll head inside, we'll talk about cemeteries in general and the early beginnings of this cemetery and its predecessor, and then we'll take a short walk and uncover some of the secrets here that you probably don't know about. So come on in. And I'm going to gather over here so people can stand in the shade a little bit. Please don't be concerned or worried about walking on graves. You cannot step in this cemetery anywhere without walking on a grave. So you all will, of course, be very careful not to step on the monuments. There are about somewhere in the area of 600 marked graves. Marked as in there is a monument, not marked as in that is where the burial is. However, this cemetery is filled beyond overflowing, and there is literally no square inch in this 5.7 acres that you can walk without stepping on somebody who's buried there. So I just want to set that concern of yours aside. As far as where we are now, we are standing in the approximate location of what we might call the third burial site of Colonial Park. The very first site was on Wright Square. We have no documentation other than a plaque on a wall as to that. We know Oglethorpe chose that site in the southwest corner of Wright Square as the first burial spot for the colony. We know it was there simply because bones were uncovered during the excavation of a street in the 1950s. What happened to those bones, we do not know. It was a time period when archaeological exploration and the sanctity of a gravesite was not as much of a concern as it is today. That cemetery very quickly filled up. And what was unusual about that cemetery was that it was not next to the church. Christ Church on Johnson Square would have, under the normal conditions of a colonial cemetery, had what was called God's Acre. And this is what you see traditionally in northern cemeteries, and even in Charleston. You see a cemetery next to the church grounds, and that is where the citizens of the colony were buried. It was very important to be buried in the church cemetery. You wanted to be buried on hallowed ground, on consecrated ground. Whether you were memorialized or not made no difference. The most important thing was that you were buried on church property. And so we're not sure why Christ Church, perhaps because of land constraints, did not have a God's Acre, but Oglethorpe did provide for that in an area on Wright Square. Of course, that quickly filled up, and the cemetery had to reappear in a new location, and it reappeared somewhere approximately there. And by 1750, a new cemetery was designed. It was a rectangular shape, and that quickly filled up. The area we are standing in, extending also into Abercorn Street, present Abercorn Street, was what we would say the third purchase, and that was at approximately 1863. And then a fourth purchase was made that bought this rectangular strip from Abercorn Street down past that white vault is the Habersham Vault, almost to where the current marker, if you're familiar, for the yellow fever epidemic is. This strip here, extending out that way of about 1.5 acres, became the cemetery by 1770. And that is the cemetery that shows up on the map of 1770. Now bear in mind, this cemetery was outside the confines of the city fortifications. And that's where you tended to put cemeteries. People at that point wanted them out in the country, away from the general population. There was a fear of contamination, contagion, bad smells, and all of those things we associate with cemeteries. When this area filled up, the remaining area was purchased. So by 1812, the maps are showing a 500-foot square, approximately 5.7 acre cemetery. And that is what Colonial Park has now. By 1812, the city was surrounding the cemetery. A good deal of the information I have and I'm going to give to you today came from a 1998 to 1999 study that was done by an archaeological foundation. And they came into the cemetery and they started trying to map the number of burials. They started to try to figure out who was buried where, what markers matched up with which gravesite, and they found it a monumental task, to say at the very least. How do you find out where a burial takes place when there's no marker? Well, you can do a type of underground radiology, which can be affected by glass bottles, by skeletons of animals, by caskets that have shifted. We have very sandy soil. I will tell you, if you put a casket down here and then pile a bunch of dirt on top of it, when you go to dig up that casket, it will probably not be in the same place. It will have shifted. The other way to tell is by soil compaction. How compacted is the soil? As graves were dug and backfilled, the density of the soil changes. Of course, the cemetery was backfilled with dirt from various places for years to level it. And so they eventually arrived at an estimate of the number of graves here and unmarked graves. So 557 marked graves in this cemetery. 8,678 unmarked graves. And you can actually look up a map, and I have one here with tiny lines drawn with tiny dots, the entire cemetery, showing every dot is a burial. So this cemetery, as I said, is not just full. It is full. The survey was done by it was the Chicora, C-H-I-C-O-R-A Foundation. And it's online too, so. And as they began investigating more, they discovered that, of course, God bless the city, but during the various restoration projects, putting in the walkways, putting in lampposts, putting in water systems, putting in water boxes, putting in historic signs. Perhaps if you are familiar with the duelist sign over in the center of the cemetery, it's right smack in the middle of a grave. There are graves here where mysteriously it looks like the gravestones kind of just butt up to the pathway. Well, the graves go under the pathway. 9 bodies, at least, were removed from Abercorn Street. And this fence, lovely as it is a 1950s fence. We are looking at a cemetery that probably, definitely extends into Abercorn and probably extends that way. So that to me is fascinating. The other fascinating thing to me is that by 1812, there was talk of establishing a stranger's burial ground and what was identified as a Negro's burial ground. And so where our police barracks and the jail are today, that is identified on an 1813 map as the Strangers' Burial Ground. And then where our playground is today, for a brief, ironically, a brief time, there was a nursery. And that nursery was to grow pride of India trees to be planted in the cemetery, because the general feeling was we need to do some landscaping and we need some vegetation and we need to make the cemetery start smelling better. And so those trees were, for a brief time, grown there. So that's the little history of the cemetery. We're going to basically concentrate on walking in this direction in the old part of the cemetery, and then we're going to walk along the wall. What happened to the evolution of the cemetery? Because this cemetery sits somewhere between that colonial Puritan cemetery in a churchyard and a cemetery like Laurel Grove. By the time this cemetery filled and Laurel Grove opened, our attitudes towards death and dying were radically changing. It was no longer that Puritan sensibility where a cemetery was a scary place. You wanted to avoid it at all cost because it was the reminder of your mortality. It was also an instructional element to your life. That saying on the gravestones is, "I am now, so you shall be, prepare for death and follow me." That's not a pleasant thought, but that was the Puritan sensibility, and that was largely the function of their cemeteries. Queen Victoria's beloved Elbert died, and our country was thrown into Victoriana and the sensibilities of that era, where cemeteries became parks. And they became places for people to visit their loved ones with landscaped grounds and beautiful trees. They were basically our early arboretums. And so people began spending time and having picnics, and there were tea houses established in cemeteries. That's Laurel Grove. And so people who had families buried here thought, whoa, this is kind of a scary place. We don't want our family here. We're going to dig them up and we're going to move them to Laurel Grove because that's fashionable. So vaults were moved, burials were moved, the Strangers' Burial Ground and what was identified as the Negro Burial Ground in 1855 were moved to Laurel Grove. How that was done, how they told who was who, how they filled back in the holes, and what happened and how many people were moved, and all of their names, we do not know. We do not know. Records for this cemetery were not started or not kept until 1804. 1804. Who originally owned the cemetery? Originally it was given to Christ Church. Christ Church maintained the original ownership of this. After everybody started leaving to Laurel Grove, the church got nervous. They were fearful that this land might be changed into something else. They petitioned the city for ownership. At that point, the city's Parks and Trees was in charge of the city. The city balked a little bit. The Catholic Church got involved as well. They wanted to have some of the land. That's when the city decided to go into litigation, and they eventually paid Christ Church $7,500 for the cemetery. So it is now under the jurisdiction of the city of Savannah. I'm just going to stop here at Samuel Elbert's. He was a mover and shaker in more ways than one. And in fact, Samuel was moved here. Let me just get to my notes so that I'm exactly correct on Samuel. Samuel Elbert and his wife were originally buried on their plantation, Ray's Hall. And in 1924, his remains were removed and buried here. The question as to why that was done, the move was made because the remains were, quote, threatened by development. That was the official answer for the removal. But that move may have partially been a desire to promote interest in the restoration of this cemetery. The cemetery has gone through a number of restorations. Restorations done by the Daughters of the American Revolution, by the city itself, by various groups throughout the city's history. And so certainly being able to remove the remains of a noted person in our country's and our state's history to this cemetery at a time when a restoration was going on made more attention focused on the cemetery. So this large box here, this of course is not original. The stone which marked his grave on his plantation would have been original, and it was set up like this. This is something called a table grave because of its appearance, and these were everywhere in the cemetery. These were everywhere. The problem with this is that after a period of time, the supports begin to deteriorate. You can see that what is happening in our cemetery are the effects of a number of things. The very worst offenders, mowers. Mowers and trimmers, they will damage the stones. That is your first line of defense that is broken. Second great offender, acid rain. These are marble by and large. Acid rain is horrible for tombstones, and they wear away the inscriptions. And there's nothing you can do, short of putting them vertically. And although the city has been widely criticized for having taken all of those broken stones and put them along the wall along the police station, it was actually their salvation. Because otherwise this happens. This was probably a table grave. It would have been rare to have this flat. It is not broken off at the bottom. If this was one of those typical colonial headstones, over half of it would have been sunk into the ground, so it stood upright, and that's where they generally break, along ground level. But because this is finished all the way around, it no doubt sat on 4 legs and was a table grave. Over time, the legs disintegrated, somebody built a modern brick footing and set it back here. Is Mary really here? We don't know. Could be. She could have been moved to Laurel Grove, and the cost of moving that stone was too much, so they just put a new one in Laurel Grove. It's one of the mysteries. I did not look up her information. I'll just point out some, if you're unaware of them. This is the Habersham family. James, a loyalist, his 3 sons, patriots, and many of their family members buried in this tomb. I'll talk a little bit more about these brick tombs, which are rather unique to South Carolina and Georgia. But the tombs, just so you know, are not above ground, they are underground. And we feel fairly certain that because this is the oldest part of the cemetery, that the location of this tomb where the Habershams are buried is where they are. So, although the tomb, to my knowledge, has never been excavated. We'll continue to walk over this way. I'm just going to hit some of the highlights of a few famous people. Of course, many of you know the story of Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene, who died, we believe, of heat stroke at the age of 43 and was buried in the Graham Vault here in Colonial Park Cemetery in 1786. The monument, as you all know, on Johnson Square had the cornerstone laid in 1825 when the Marquis de Lafayette came. And at that time, Greene's remains were still here. There was speculation about where Greene was. These 4 vaults were here. And it wasn't until 1902 that a delegation from Rhode Island was able to begin an investigation of these vaults. The first one that they opened was empty because they didn't know which vault was the Graham Vault. And they didn't even know whether it was the Graham Vault. So they finally were able to get into this particular vault, and they did find 3 skeletons, one of a teenager and then 2 adults. And you can actually read the account. I don't want to say I'm leery, but I'll take the account at face value of finding the skeleton, finding embedded in the chest cavity a nameplate, which they say there is a photograph of, although I haven't been able to find that photograph. They did also mention shards of silk on the forearm with finger bones in what appeared to be a glove. And so we do know that Lafayette gave Greene's widow white silk gloves commonly given to French officers for Greene to be buried in. And so those shards of silk with the finger bones seem to be an indication that this particular skeleton was Greene's. They also found tiny buttons with a vague imprint of an eagle on it, which would have been an officer's buttons. From what I read, they were wood, and they would have been covered with silk, which was then gone. But all of that information and identifying marks seemed enough to identify those bones as Greene's and the bones of the younger person as his son. And then those remains were removed to Johnson Square. Of course, Archibald Bulloch was the first person to read the Declaration of Independence in Johnson Square. His monument here, the urn on the top, a Grecian motif used often to help us remember that idea of classical concepts of death and dying. Some people call it a cremation urn. I'm less convinced about that, more that it is a classical element that was used often in mortuary memorialization. The snake that appears on four sides is clasping sort of part of his body, and traditionally that snake is a symbol of eternity in a cemetery. This brick pedestal that this is on is not original, and certainly this whole area is covering graves of people we do not know. But Archibald Bulloch's original monument would have probably been slightly larger than this. There would have been another bottom portion which got destroyed or lost, and so this modern brick area was made to elevate that to a proper height befitting a man of his stature. What I'm really interested in here, however, is this stone. So if you want to come around here and take a look at it, and I'll stand behind it, because this is one of the stories that many people don't know. So it's an old stone, and it is very much in the style of a Puritan stone, befitting the sensibility of somebody from the North. And indeed, Dr. Samuel Vickers was from New Brunswick, New Jersey. This angel at the top has an interesting history as far as monument design. Originally, the Puritans were not allowed art, and so what they did is they put their only art into cemeteries. And because of their sensibility that death was terrifying and frightening and something to be avoided, and it was what taught you how to behave so that you would have a good life in the afterlife, this was often a skull with crossbones. And we'll see an example of the only one I know of in the cemetery over on the wall. Well, women began losing children. And during Queen Victoria's time, children died by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands. And the whole idea of putting a skull and crossbones on a child's headstone was not palatable to the Victorian sensibility. And so gradually, and in northern cemeteries, you can see the evolution. The skeleton head starts to soften. Gradually, the skeleton head becomes childlike looking, and the crossbones evolve and morph into wings. And so this becomes very much what we have in our mind of that early colonial gravestone. So what do we know about Samuel? Samuel was 30 years old when he died in 1785, and let me get all my information so I don't mislead any of you. It is a fascinating story. He attended Queens College, which is now Rutgers, and we believe he was in the first graduating class of Princeton University. For some reason, his degree was not awarded at the ceremony. Whether he was there or not is unknown. But he was born in 1755, and it was the beginning of the American Revolution when he graduated from Princeton. He became a surgeon's mate with the Continental Army, and he was a surgeon by 1779. He was transferred for duty to the Carolinas in 1780, and he became the senior surgeon of a flying hospital at Cheraw, South Carolina. I may be pronouncing that wrong, C-H-E-R-A-W, Cheraw, South Carolina. That was the flying hospital, but basically a field hospital. And there is a possible account of what may have happened during his time as the senior surgeon at a very young age, by our recollection, at that hospital. Military activity was particularly heavy in 1780 to 81. The very cruel British officer, Major Weems, was burning and plundering. Major MacArthur was with the 71st Highlanders and was left to keep some sort of hold on the countryside. Many of his Highlanders died, probably from smallpox. Those men lie in a mass grave. General Gates passed west of the city his hungry men eating green corn and peaches. The resulting diarrhea had an extremely adverse effect on American fortunes. The Americans established headquarters by 1780. Whigs and Tories continued to wage a bloody war, which the general called the worst he had ever seen, quoting, "The violence here was utterly unknown in any other part of the Union." In December 1780, General Nathaniel Greene arrived with a large part of his army. They stayed until 1781, and they were able to achieve an American victory, which General Greene toasted with cherry bounce. Yes. There is a story that the term lynch came from the officer in charge of the camp who had a habit of convicting people without a trial. It is also here where Light Horse Harry Lee came into camp with Greene, and the Americans at that point were able to establish a forward outpost. General Greene left and headed to the Guilford Courthouse, where one of the major battles of the Revolution that eventually led to the American victory at Yorktown occurred. This man was the senior surgeon at that time in that area. He was promoted to Secretary of War by Benjamin Lincoln, but he was promoted by Benjamin Lincoln, Secretary of War, to surgeons of hospitals in 1782. And then for some reason, he left Charleston. We do know he was suffering severely from malaria. He actually made a point of writing about that in a letter, how sick he was from the effects. In 1785, he went back to New Jersey to collect his degree from Princeton. And then, on the day of his death, there is an account in the newspaper. Late Saturday forenoon, Dr. Samuel Vickers shot himself with a pistol in the garden of Sharon Plantation and immediately expired. The coroner's inquest found he had been for some time before insane and not of sound memory and perfect understanding. Some accounts list Sharon Plantation as his home. This was a plantation in the vicinity of Mulberry Grove. Anthony Wayne's forces encamped there in 1782. At that time, it was owned by a descendant, by a woman named Mrs. Gibbons, and it went from Mrs. Gibbons to Edward Telfair. Whether this was his home or whether he was simply on the plantation, we do not know. As an interesting aside, this man wrote a letter in 1780 describing a battle he had witnessed during the Revolutionary War on Long Island. That letter somehow found its way into the collection of letters owned by Alexander Hamilton. That collection of letters was auctioned by Sotheby's January 17th of this year for $2.6 million. The letter from Dr. Vickers included in that, and of course many of the letters referenced music in the play Hamilton, and that spurred great interest in this collection of letters. We do not know, I can't find out how much his letter sold for, but it was in that collection. So there's Dr. Samuel Vickers. Now hopefully none of you knew that story, so now you know. All right. I'm going to briefly touch on Button Gwinnett because everybody wants to know the story of Button Gwinnett. Is Button Gwinnett buried here? The Historical Society likes to believe so. But the story of Button Gwinnett is an interesting one. He is the only one of 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence that we do not know exactly where he's buried, but we hope it's here. The other two from Georgia, anybody know who they were? Oh, I'm going to trick you up. Yeah? Lyman Hall and George Walton. They are buried in Augusta. So the story of Mr. Button's is that about 7 paces from Mr. Bulloch's grave, a retired Savannah school principal, Arthur Funk, in 1957, found a broken off brown sandstone monument. It had been broken off at ground level. He got permission to excavate a little bit, and he found a letter G, a letter C, a letter T, and a number 7. Okay, that is enough for him to believe that this may be Button Gwinnett. Okay, so they contacted Lewis H. Larson Jr. from the Georgia Historical Commission. The grave is excavated. and they don't find just one skeleton. They find a number of poorly preserved skeletons all kind of jumbled together. But they were able to piece together one poorly preserved skeleton with a little bit of hair on the skull that was a 5 foot 6.5-inch person, which, as far as we know, is Button Gwinnett's size, although we have no known orthodox portraits of him. It's believed he was a somewhat short man. Dr. A.J. Ware sent the bone to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian examined the bone and determined that the damage, because they were all excited, there was damage to the hip of the femur, the hip area of the femur. The Smithsonian authority said, I think this damage was done after burial because people are digging down. We know that workers just took bones and they moved them aside in order to put a burial in. They just tossed them side to side. So the general feeling from the Smithsonian was that that damage was done after death, and that the person was shorter. The person was by measuring the femur, the person was approximately 5 feet 4 inches, my height, and that it was female. That did not deter the authorities here. A ballistics person here examined the bones, ballistics experts, and he said, oh no, that is a pistol wound, and a 10-year battle ensued here in Savannah. Augusta wanted the bones so they could be buried with the other 2 men. Savannah wanted the bones. Meanwhile, this retired principal has the bones in a little box in his guest room. Eventually, according to my records, the Savannah-Chatham County Historic Site Commission did their own investigation and concluded that these were definitely Gwinnett's remains, and his bones would be buried. $9,000 was raised for the monument, and the monument was established and unveiled on the anniversary of the surrender of Yorktown in 1964. Lyman Hall and George Walton are still in Augusta, and Augusta actually dropped their efforts to have Button Gwinnett's remains exhumed and moved, and they actually tongue-in-cheek said it would be unkind to remove the bones of an old lady anyway. So whether that's the true story, whether Button Gwinnett is actually buried here at all, whether he's actually buried here, we do know that the man who shot him is here, Langland McIntosh, over on the Abercorn side, but I will leave that all to you. It is one of the great, great mysteries of our cemetery. We all hope it's him, of course, but please, I urge you to say this is not his monument. We don't know where that little tiny piece is that has the letters on it. This is a memorial to him based on the information of where we think he may be buried, and that's the best we can do. There is a historic marker denoting the deaths from the 1820 yellow fever epidemic. One of the myths that it continues to fester in this cemetery is that there was a mass grave. My study shows there is no mass grave. Yellow fever victims were simply buried here. We do have the third identified victim, a man whose name is Paul Stanton, and he is identified in the records as having lived in Washington Square. He was a merchant there, and he was the third identified victim. And the first time the doctors identified the black vomit symptom. That is noted in historical records. But a mass grave, no. Let me just gather in the shade here so I can take a moment to talk about these brick tombs. Some of the tombs were relocated to Laurel Grove. Some of the tombs disintegrated, and you can, as you walk through the cemetery, just see brick outlines. But basically what we know about the tombs, and here I'm going to break hearts, the most endearing legend that this cemetery has, and one that our tour guides love to tell, is that during Sherman's occupation, 1864 through January of 1865, the Union soldiers were quartered here in the cemetery. There is absolutely no documentation to support that. In fact, the only documentation is an observation by one Union soldier that the cemetery was in poor condition. So we love to tell the story that the Union soldiers were quartered here with their animals, that it was cold and rainy, and they broke into the vaults and threw the bodies out and moved in for the 41 days. That may have happened, but 4 tombs were excavated during this 1998 to 99 study, and absolutely no evidence of that was found in any of those 4 tombs. Additionally, as you walk through the cemetery, you will see where ages have been changed, zeros have been added to ages, dates have been added. That is definitely there. It is graffiti. When that graffiti occurred, who did it, we do not know. Part of what we love here in the South is to do everything we can to, talk about those dirty, rotten Union soldier scoundrels, and certainly the prevailing myths and legends in Colonial Park are all part of that. But currently, through my limited research, I can find nothing to support the claim that the soldiers broke into the tombs, nor that they defaced the monuments. So we can cringe when the tour guides say that. As far as the monuments themselves, they are below ground. They are constructed most commonly on the exterior of an imported orange-red fine brick. Below ground, they are Savannah gray, which was the more common brick. They are anywhere between 5 to 8 feet below ground. And upon excavation, the archaeologists found 2 different methods to enter these tombs. One was an at ground. Now bear in mind, through backfilling over the years, the ground has been built up on these. So at one point, much more of the monument would have actually shown. But this curved opening that's been bricked, that was the entrance and egress from the tomb. And basically in the case of this one, it may or may not have had bricks at the time, but commonly they did. That was the least expensive way to close them. And there are accounts of bricking the tomb after burial. Sometimes there were stone slabs and a kind of a locking system put over the front. And the system and the size and the construction of the tomb varied with the amount of money spent on the tomb. If you had an at-grade level entrance, if you were going to put a body in there, either in a casket or simply in a shroud, basically somebody went in at ground level and dropped down the 5 feet. And then somebody on the outside would have rather awkwardly pushed the body in. The person inside would have caught it and lowered it down to the floor. 3 of the 4 tombs excavated found no shelving. 1 found simple kind of 4 shelving unit. More than likely, the casket was just put on the ground, the person inside slithered out, and the tomb was rebricked. So, they also found 1 tomb which had stairs. Now, these were not stairs necessarily as a matter of a way to enter or exit the tomb as we think of today in Laurel Grove. These were stairs to facilitate the sliding of the casket down. So it simply made it a little easier for the poor person inside accepting the casket to have it slid down as a kind of a makeshift type stone staircase in order to accept the tomb and then put it on the ground. So tombs placed rather haphazardly sometimes throughout the cemetery. It appeared that there was no sort of governance. The church did not say, here's where you're going to put it, here's where you're going to put it. They kind of just said, okay, we're going to build a tomb and this is our parcel and we're going to build it. Generally, the study found that this cemetery follows the Christian practice of burying people facing east, so that at resurrection they would be facing the proper direction for their ascent into heaven. So the premise is that many of our tombs here our burials are in a eastward facing direction. If you haven't walked this wall before, I do urge you to. As I said, we're very fortunate in retrospect that the remains of monuments that either deteriorated through acid rain, were knocked over through vandalism. This cemetery was a playground of sorts. It was also heavily vandalized. At one point, it was under the jurisdiction of the Scavenger and Sanitation division of the city. And so anything that was picked up out of a privy, because the privies were periodically periodically cleaned out. Dry wells were cleaned out. This is where it ended up. There are records of the cemetery, citizens urging to have the cemetery enclosed with a brick wall, which was eventually done because of wild animals and dogs digging up the remains. And just through the passage of time, monuments break and they get scattered. And so originally, and you will find people who were incensed that this happened, but it actually saved them. We don't know where these people are buried, all of them, but we at least have this wonderful record of these beautiful carvings. Many of these carvings, monuments were carved by noted tombstone carvers, especially from the north, and you'll see some of the most elaborate ones from people who were from Rhode Island and New York and New Jersey, and no doubt the tombstones were carved there and bought here. The weeping willow, the weeping tree, a very popular motif. The material, this one for Levi Rist, who I can find nothing about, has a beautiful tree. And so the art is gorgeous and valuable. I will caution the city that this is valuable commodity and that you will often find these up for auction. I'm going to walk down this way. You'll find sandstone often holds an inscription very well. This is Abigail Lillibridge, and the first name that comes to you when I say Lillibridge is probably what? The Hampton Lillibridge house that Jim Williams restored here on the east side, which is supposedly one of the most haunted houses in Savannah. That Hampton Lillibridge was a wealthy merchant here in the city who died in the 1800s. But Abigail Lillibridge was actually from Rhode Island, and she was the daughter of the deputy governor of Rhode Island and a Supreme Court district judge in Rhode Island in the 1600s. She married a man, John Lillibridge, who eventually became an alderman, and she had 4 sons. Actually, she had 5 sons. Her 4 sons who lived into childhood, one of them was Hampton, and he died at age 15. So that's the first place I find that name coming in. She died at age 37 and is buried with her infant son. So we have to assume she died in childbirth. So a woman from Rhode Island, the daughter of an important politician in that state, making her way here, dying at age 37 in childbirth with her 5th child after having given birth to 4 sons. Where her husband John is, we do not know. He remarried, and there's no record that he's buried in the cemetery. So she's alone. Is she right here? She's somewhere. The tombstones today, if any of you ever watched tombstone being carved, tombstone is carved with by sandblasting. And basically it is all done by machine. These tombstones were all carved by hand. And you can see the difference in the lettering. You can see the elaborate ornamentation that many of them had, bearing in mind that all over the country, and particularly on the Northeast, there were noted tombstone carvers. Many of them signed their tombstones on these. We've lost the inscriptions because the tombstones are broken off. But something like this, the typical Grecian learn, the laurel roping, was all part of kind of a sensibility that determined what was appropriate to put on a tombstone. So this tombstone, Jacob R. Taylor, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. How he got here, we do not know. The tombstone is slightly illegible, but luckily the inscription was taken at one point, and it reads, "Walking unarmed and peaceably on the streets, this young man was attacked and inhumanely decimated by an army of bandits belonging to the crews of the French privateers La Vengeance and La Française. Rest infinite youth far from friends inurned, by strangers honored and by strangers mourned. Though thy lone turf no kindred drops can lave, yet virtue hollows with her tears thy grave." Well, there's obviously a story here. And the story is this young man, the son of a John P. Taylor of Philadelphia, found his way in Savannah, as many young people do today. He was out drinking, probably, and found himself at a brothel. And on November 11th, 1911, at age 19, came out of the brothel and got engaged in a brawl. Anti-French sentiment had been smoldering throughout the city in the months previous to this incident. The politicians in the city seemed unaware of that, but some sort of argument ensued, and he was killed by privateers, in essence pirates, from these two French ships which were in our port. They were waiting for sailors to come from Charleston to join them so that they could continue on with their journey. One of them was stocked with quite a bit of goods, and there was an all-out. It became an all-city brawl because 2 days later, 2 more Americans were killed. The 34 of the French privateers were rounded up and taken to jail, and that set the city into an absolute ferment. People decided that they were going to take things into their own hands. The French were upset because Americans hadn't been arrested. The Americans were upset because they didn't feel the city had done anything. The volunteer guards and the mayor arrived. They did their best to keep the peace, but the city would have none of it. The city citizens would have none of it. They actually cut the rigging on the ships, set them on fire. That was it. That was it. So the death of this young man spawned this citywide hysteria, which resulted in the burning of these 2 French privateer ships and the arrest of many people. And as far as I could tell, there wasn't a trial and no one was formally charged. But it did uncover this kind of seething sediment, and this is part of that whole time period of pirates and privateers. There is some suggestion that Jean Lafitte, the New Orleans pirates, may have somehow been involved with that too, but that's going to need further investigation. And one last one. Oh, here's that skull and crossbones. It's the only one I know of. But there's the skull, there are the crossbones. That was a particular Puritan motif. And as time went on, that skull, and in some cemeteries it's very pronounced, that skull softens, the bones change, and it becomes an angel. Pretty awesome. This monument, it says, beneath the stone lies interred the body of Mr. Gabriel Leaver, late of this city, cabinet maker. Cabinet maker. Gabriel Leaver. He was born in London in October 22nd, 1757, died October 22nd, 1795. He's an English cabinet maker, and I found documentation suggesting, although not completely known, but suggesting that the Telfair Museum has several of his pieces. He married a woman, Mary Scheck, in the early 1780s. She died in 1817. She is buried in Laurel Grove. He was a very well-to-do citizen. He was very savvy. In addition to making cabinets, he purchased land. One of the pieces of land he purchased is today where the president's quarters is. And that was at one point the governor home of a very unpopular royal governor, John Reynolds. He owned 3 plantations west of Savannah. And he lived next to Mordecai Scheftel on Broughton Street. That was his primary residence. Gabriel Leaver, in some documents he is listed as being Jewish. In some documents he's listed as being Christian. In some documents he's listed as being both. He was a personal friend of Peter Tondy. He actually settled Peter Tondy's estate and the estate of his wife, and there is some suggestion he was a casket maker. Cabinet makers often were casket makers, and I found some suggestion that he may have built Peter Tondy's casket. He also was involved in a bit of an altercation with the man where we started our tour, Governor Samuel Elbert. At the point that the governor was in office, he apparently ordered a pine table. And Mr. Leaver made that pine table, and then it was not paid for it in the amount of some pounds, 6 pounds, 7 pence. He had to sue the state for the payment of his table. He had 1 child. Her name was Mary Magdalene Leaver. At age 16, she married a man from St. Augustine whose name was Marshall. And when Gabriel Leaver died, he was buried in the in a tomb in the backyard of the old Marshall House. And the old Marshall House was at 47 West Broad. 47 West Broad. That house was demolished. Now, Mary Magdalene Marshall inherited a fortune. All of the land that her father had, the houses that he owned, the business that he owned, and she began building. Do you know what she built? Marshall House. The Marshall House. Her portrait, done in 1830, hangs over the front desk, in the back of the front desk. And that was a portrait that was purchased from the Jim Williams estate. I actually contacted the Marshall House. This is how legend gets perpetuated and spread. On their website, they said that Gabriel was a French cabinet maker and that he died in 1855. I contacted the innkeeper, and she was darling and charming, and she said, yeah, I think we have an error here, because I gave her my information and she assured me they would be fixing it. But if you can see as you go online, that error perpetuates itself over and over and over and over and over again. So Mary Marshall, how did this stone get here? Obviously, this stone with its inscription as it reads was in the backyard of the Marshall House at 47 West Broad. And then when I investigated further, I found a tombstone for Gabriel Leaver in Laurel Grove Cemetery that bears absolutely no resemblance to this one. And his wife, a totally different inscription, but the same date. And then when I further investigated, I found that both Gabriel and his wife were buried, and there's a little B in the record, in Laurel Grove on February 2nd, 1855. Hence the Marshall House's confusion. So, the big mystery here is this. This stone was definitely the one, it is as it is described, that was at 47 West Broad, where he was buried. The question is, did Mary, his only daughter, bring him here to Colonial Park? Or did she immediately move him? I don't know when that house was demolished, and that would be something for historians to look for. Did she immediately move him from 47 West Broad to Colonial in 1855? And at the time of the demolishment of the house, somebody said, whoa, here's a tombstone. Where do we put this? Oh, let's put it in Colonial Park. It is the entire stone. It is, they are calling it brown granite. I don't know. Robert would have to, my husband's a geologist, so he would have to get down here and try to look at it. It was never set up. It looks like it was simply placed here. He was a Mason, a Masonic symbol at the top, but another mystery that I leave you with in this wonderful cemetery is we have to trust that he is buried in Laurel Grove, but is he one of those movers that made his way and was actually buried 3 different times? Marshall House, Colonial Park, and finally Laurel Grove. I sometimes chuckle as I walk around Savannah with our love for myth, our love of ghost stories, our delight at being one of the 10 most haunted cities in the United States. The way we treat our dead, it is sometimes no wonder that there are so many spirits wandering around trying to figure out where they belong. I thank you very much. I tried to make my talk as historically accurate as possible, given the fact that when you Google Marshall House, all you get is a lot of ghost stories. So I hope this spurred your interest, that you'll walk through our cemetery, take some photographs. You'll be amazed at what you can find through records. Armstrong has fabulous theses written by many of their students, as does the University of Georgia. Genealogical records, ancestry, a lot of information is available for free, and also the Historical Society is an absolute treasure trove of information on the cemetery. Thank you all so much. You were a wonderful audience, and if you have any questions, I'm glad to try to answer them. But enjoy this beautiful day and this beautiful jewel in our city. It's really quite remarkable.